She found him because the fox did not. Maren had followed its tracks 1/2 mile through the birches above Aldermere, expecting a rabbit or a struck grouse, and instead the tracks bent sharp around a shape in the snow and did not come back. She knelt where the fox had knelt. A man lay face down under the oak with an arrow snapped off in his shoulder and his cloak frozen stiff to the ground beneath him, and when she rolled him half over his eyes opened, and found hers before his mouth could shape a single word of thanks or warning. She did not ask his name. She got her hands under his arms instead, because a name would keep till morning and blood would not, and she was already doing the arithmetic her mother had taught her without meaning to teach it, the weight of a grown man against the length of daylight left, the distance to her own hearth against the distance to the village, the certainty that whoever had put that arrow in him was still somewhere behind them in the trees. She dragged him onto the sledge she used for deadwood, and put her own shawl over his face against the cold, and told him, in the flat voice she used on frightened animals, that he was going to be still and quiet and alive, in that order. In her apron pocket, knocking against her hip the whole way home, was a small carved robin her father had made her the winter before he died. One wing snapped clean off years ago in a fall she no longer let herself remember in detail, and she found her thumb going to the break in it the way it always did, when her hands had nothing else to hold, and her mind had too much. The cottage stood at the tree line, where the forest gave up, trying to be forest, and the fields began, close enough to Aldermere to hear its bell on a still evening, and far enough that no one came without meaning to, which was how her mother had wanted it, and how Maren, 9 years alone, had learned to want it too. She got the stranger onto her own pallet by the fire, cut the arrow shaft with her father's old knife, rather than draw it whole, and packed the wound with yarrow and the last of the bruised comfrey root before he woke enough to grip her wrist hard enough to bruise it. "Who are you?" he said, and she said, "The person deciding whether to pull this arrow out the kind way or the quick way, so you had better lie still either way." He laughed, which cost him, and stopped. Outside the wind came up off the fields and rattled the shutter, and somewhere far off toward the tally house a single lantern burned in the dark the way it always did, the one steady light in all that black country, and Maren banked her fire, and did not sleep, and did not yet know that by the time that lantern guttered out with the dawn her cottage would have a ring of armed men around it, wanting to know why. She had been an outcast of a particular well-worn kind since she was 15, the kind the village tolerated because it needed her poultices and distrusted because it remembered her mother, and she understood before she understood anything else about the man on her hearth that whoever he was, keeping him alive under her roof, was not a kindness the world would read as simple. Sella came at first light with a basket of new bread she had no good reason to be bringing, and every reason in the world, and stood over the stranger with her arms folded like a woman assessing a badly built fence. "Well," said Sella, "you always did bring home strays too big for the house." "He is not a stray," said Maren. "No," said Sella, looking at the cut of the cloak, the good wool of it, the boot leather no farmer had ever worn. "He is a great deal worse than a stray, and I expect we will both be sorry before the week is out." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way she said most things, like a woman setting a fact down on a table between them so they could both look at it, and then she said the thing her own mother used to say, and that Maren's mother had said back to her more times than either of them had ever explained. "The snow keeps nothing that isn't given back in spring," and went to put the kettle on, as though she had not just handed Maren a small stone to carry all day in her pocket alongside the robin. It was mid-morning when the horn sounded from the road, 3 short notes, and then a 4th held long, and by the time Maren reached her own doorway there were a dozen mounted men drawn up along the tree line, with the grey and green of Marchful on their coats, and their breath and their horses' breath rising together in the cold like a single-held thought. The captain, who came forward alone, hand loose and open at his side, was a broad, weathered man Maren had seen twice before at the harvest tithing and never spoken to. And he stopped at the exact distance a careful man stops from a door he does not yet trust. "Captain Ossian, of the Duke's household," he said, "and I am looking for a man who left the Tally House 3 days past, and has not been seen since, and I would take it very kindly, mistress, if you would tell me whether that man is inside your house. Because I have 12 riders behind me, who will search it whether you tell me or not. And I would rather you told me." Maren stood in her own doorway with her hand on the frame, and did the arithmetic again, and this time it came out differently than it had in the snow, because now the numbers included Sella at the wash-tub, with her back very straight, and a wounded man behind her who had not given his name, and a captain who had said the Duke's household as though it were the most ordinary phrase in the world, and watched her face while he said it to see what it did there. "He is here," she said, because a lie told to 12 armed men rarely improves with the telling, "and he is alive, which I would like credit for, and he has an arrow wound in his shoulder that I have cleaned and packed, and that will need a week at the least before he rides anywhere." Something moved behind the captain's eyes that was not quite relief and not quite fear, but shared a border with both. 12 men dismounted at once without being told to, which told Maren more about who she was harbouring than any name could have. She let the captain in alone first, on his own request, and stood in the doorway of her own front room, while Ossian crossed to the pallet and went down on one knee beside it faster than a man his age and size had any business going down, and said, in a voice gone rough at the edges, "Your Grace, we thought you drowned at the ford. We have had every man in the march out since dawn, the day before last." The stranger on her hearth, who had told her nothing but his gratitude and one bad joke about arrows, opened his eyes and said, "Not drowned, Ossian, only shot," which is a different sort of foolishness entirely. And then his eyes found Maren's over the captain's bent shoulder, and something in his face asked her pardon for a thing he had not yet had time to say aloud. Maren felt the floor of her own understanding tilt very quietly under her, the way ice does before it lets a foot through, and did not let it show on her face, because that was a thing her mother had also taught her, without meaning to, a long time ago. "Your Grace," she said, testing the shape of it in her own mouth, and the Duke of Marchful, propped against her hearthstones with her own quilt over his ruined coat, had the grace to look almost apologetic about it. "Aldric," he said. "My name is Aldric, when I am not being shot at, and I am sorry, mistress, that you had to find out the rest of it from Ossian rather than from me, though in my defence I was somewhat occupied with dying at the time." Outside, the 11 remaining riders stood their horses in the cold and did not come nearer, and word of where the Duke had been found ran ahead of them back toward Aldermary faster than any rider could have carried it, the way such word always does, so that by the time Ossian sent 2 men back to the hall for a litter and dry linen the whole village already knew. In that particular garbled way villagers know things, that the witch's daughter had the Duke in her bed. Maren heard the shape of that phrase before she heard the words of it, in the careful new distance villagers kept from her doorway over the following days, in the way old Wren the miller would not meet her eye at the well, though he had traded her flour for tinctures for a decade, without a flicker of unease. It cost her nothing she had not already learned to carry. It cost Aldric more, though he did not say so plainly for some days. being a man who had been raised from the cradle to treat his own discomfort as a private matter unfit for other people's attention. He healed slowly and badly at first, and then, under her hands and Sella's broth, less badly. And in the space those slow days made between them he talked. Because a man flat on his back, with nothing to do but watch a woman work, is a man who will talk eventually whether he means to or not. He told her, in pieces, what had happened at the ford, that he had ridden out from the hall 3 days before with only 2 men, to inspect the tally house himself, because the North March accounts had come to him with a discrepancy he could not make sense of on paper alone. Some 100 measures of grain, tithed and recorded, and somehow never delivered to the granary that should have held them. And that somewhere on the road back an arrow had come out of the trees and taken his second man clean through the throat, before either of them had time to name the direction it came from. He had ridden until his horse went down under him at the ford, and had walked, he thought, though he could not afterward account for how far, before the cold and the blood took the rest of the choice out of his hands. He told her this, the way a man tells a story he has already turned over many times alone in the dark, evenly, without much heat in it. And she listened the way her mother had taught her to listen to a fevered patient, for the thing under the words rather than the words themselves. And what she heard under it was that he did not believe the arrow had come from strangers. "Someone in your own house," she said, not quite a question, and watched him go still in the particular way of a man who has been caught thinking a thing he had not decided yet to say aloud. He did not answer that directly. Instead he asked her, on the 3rd evening, with the firelight doing something unfair to the line of his jaw, why a woman with her skill and her father's steady hands had never married into the village, and Marin, who had not told this story to anyone in 9 years because no one had thought to ask it kindly, found herself telling it anyway, the whole of it, her mother's arrest on the word of a tinker, who had never once set foot in. Aldemir before that winter, and never again after. The trial that lasted less than an hour. The exile that was meant to be mercy and killed her mother of fever on the road within the month regardless. And the small carved robin, missing its wing since the day her father fell from the mill roof, trying to mend it in a temper of grief he never spoke of afterward either. She had not meant to bring the robin out of her pocket while she talked. She found it in her hand anyway when she finished, turning it over and over the way she always did, and Aldrich looked at the broken wing a long moment before he looked back at her face, and said only, "Whoever signed that warrant owed your mother a better hour than an hour," and something in the plainness of it undid a knot in Marin's chest that 9 years of silence had never managed to loosen. It was Ossian, 2 mornings later, who told them Reeve Holden Vance had ridden out from the hall to see the Duke's recovery for himself, and that Lady Ceridwen of Esk, to whom the Duke was promised, had sent word she would follow within the week. And the small warm room Marin and Aldrich had built between them, without quite meaning to shrank at once back down to the size of a debt about to come. Due. Holden Vance arrived at noon on a bay gelding too fine for a steward's purse, with 4 men behind him, and a smile that reached Marin's doorstep a full breath before he did, and she understood before he had dismounted that this was a man who had practised the art of being liked for so long that it had become, for him, indistinguishable from being honest. "Mistress Marin," he said. As though they were old friends resuming a pleasant conversation, "I have heard a great deal of your skill this past week, and I am glad the march has such hands in it, though I confess I am gladder still to see my Duke sitting up and taking broth instead of lying dead in a ditch, which is what half the hall had already resigned itself to mourning." He bowed to Aldrich with exactly the correct depth, no more and no less, and asked after the wound, and after the arrow, and after whether the Duke had seen the men who loosed it, all in the same unhurried, solicitous voice. And Marin, watching from the hearth, saw his hand go once, briefly, to smooth the cuff of his sleeve before he asked that last question. A small, precise gesture she would not have noticed at all, if she had not spent 9 years learning to read the hands of people who did not want to be read. Aldrich answered him with equal smoothness that he had seen nothing, that the wood had been too thick and the light too far gone, and if Holden was disappointed by that answer, he did not let it reach his face. He turned that same warm attention on Marin then, and it was worse for being turned on her, because he asked, with every appearance of simple courtesy, whether she was not the daughter of the herb wife Isolde, and when she said she was, he said, with a small sorrowful shake of his head, a hard business, that, and a hard winter for it. I remember it troubled Justice Holt greatly even at the time. Though the law does not always leave a magistrate room to trouble himself as much as his conscience might like. It was the first time in 9 years anyone from the hall had spoken her mother's name to her, without lowering their voice first. And Marin felt the whole of the village's careful distance folded somehow into the gentle, regretful way he said it, as though he were not the reason for that distance at all, but merely a kind man remembering an old sadness alongside her. Later, once he had gone, Aldrich asked her quietly what she made of him, and she said, "He is sorry about a great many things very beautifully." And Aldrich almost smiled and said, "That has always been his particular gift," and did not say more, because Ossian came in just then to say the hall was readying rooms for the Duke's return within the week, and the sentence Aldrich had been about to finish went unfinished, the way sentences do at moments that matter most. Lady Ceridwen arrived 3 days after that, and she was not at all what Marin had braced herself to dislike. She was tall and plainly dressed for travel, and had a face that gave away exactly as much as she intended it to, and not one thing more, and she took Marin's hand in both of hers at the cottage door and said, "You kept him alive, which the whole march owes you for, whatever else it may also owe you," in a tone that made the second half of the sentence sound less like a threat than an honest accounting of a debt Ceridwen intended, eventually, to see paid properly. She sat with Aldrich a long while that evening, with the door left open, which Marin understood to be a courtesy in itself, and when she came out again, she paused beside Marin at the hearth, and said, without any particular unkindness, "He speaks of you the way men speak of weather they did not expect, and cannot now stop watching. And I have known him 12 years, and never once heard him do it before, and then, before Marin could find any answer at all, she added, I am not your enemy in this, mistress, whatever comes," and went out into the cold, with her cloak drawn close, leaving Marin standing by her own fire, with the robin turning slowly over and over in her hand. The discrepancy Aldrich had ridden out to inspect came back into the room 3 mornings later, in the smallest and least dramatic way imaginable, when Marin fed the last of a torn ledger page into the fire to catch the kindling, and Aldrich, half risen from his pallet for the first time without help, caught her wrist before the page went into the flame. "Where did that come from?" he said, and there was nothing idle left in his voice at all. She told him the truth, that Sella had brought a bundle of scrap paper from the tally clerk's leavings weeks before, the way she always scavenged waste paper for kindling and wrapping, and that this had simply been in the pile. Aldrich smoothed the singed corner flat against his knee, and read what was left of it twice, his mouth moving faintly over the figures. And then he said, very quietly, "This is the North March tithe for the autumn before last, and the sum recorded here does not match the sum in the hall's own copy, not by a little, by nearly a fifth." And he looked up at Maren with an expression she had not yet seen on him, something between dread and a terrible unwilling excitement, the look of a man realizing the shape of the wall he has been walking toward in the dark. Sella, sent for, arrived with her usual unhurried authority and looked at the scrap for a long moment before she said, "The tally clerk before this one died of a bad winter 3 years back, God rest him, and Holden Vance has kept his own hand on those books since, which is not a crime, mind, a steward keeping his own accounts, but it is not nothing either." And then she said the thing Maren's mother used to say, dressed in her own plain clothes, "A debt does not rot in a drawer, girl. It only waits there for someone honest enough to open the drawer," and looked hard at Aldrich while she said it, as though daring him to be that someone. He was, or meant to be. He sent Ossian quietly to Justice Emmerich Holt, the old magistrate long retired to a stone house above the ford, not with soldiers, but with a single unmarked request that the justice receive the Duke privately and discreetly, and within 2 days word came back that Holt would see him, alone if possible, and would speak plainly, being too old now to fear much of anything that a younger man's temper could do to him. Maren went with Aldrich to that meeting, though no one had asked her to, because her mother's name sat under the whole of it like a stone under still water, and Holt, when he opened his door to them, looked at her face for a long moment before he looked at Aldrich's at all, and said, "You have your mother's eyes, and I have owed them an apology for 9 years that I did not have the courage to pay while she was living." He was an old man, spare and careful with his words the way age had made him careful with everything else, and he told them, sitting by his own small fire, with his hands folded and still, that the testimony against Isolde had come from a travelling man none of the village had ever seen before or since, paid, Holt now believed, though he could not prove it, to say what he said, and that the man who had brought that witness before the court and pressed hardest for the swiftest possible sentence, sparing the court a longer trial that might have asked harder questions, had been a young steward new to his post that same winter, eager to be seen doing the hall's business efficiently. "Holden Vance," said Aldrich, and it was not a question either. Holt did not answer it in words. He rose instead, slowly, and went to a locked chest beneath his window, and said, "I kept the court roll from that day, against every rule of my office, because even then something about the haste of it sat wrong in me, and I did not trust myself to forget why." And inside the roll, folded small and pressed flat by 9 years under other papers, was a second thing Holt had also kept, without quite admitting to himself why he kept it, a short letter in a steady clerk's hand, promising a sum of silver for testimony, delivered before the assizes, unsigned, but sealed with a signet Aldrich recognised on sight, because he had watched Holden Vance press that same seal into wax 100 times across 100 ordinary documents of state. "Read it aloud," Holt said, "so that none of us 3 can later pretend to each other we heard something different," and Aldrich did, in the small stone room, in a voice that shook once on Isolde's name and steadied after, and Maren stood very still, with the robin gripped so hard in her pocket that the broken wing's edge bit into her palm, and felt 9 years of a grief she had carefully never let finish finally arrive. They did not reach the hall again before the worst of it caught them. Holden Vance had ridden to Holt's own gate not an hour behind them, drawn by whatever quiet word had already reached him that the Duke was asking after old court rolls, and he stood in the old man's doorway with his 4 men behind him and his smile arriving, for the first time since Maren had met him, a full second after his eyes rather than before them. "Your Grace," he said, "I had not thought to find you so far from your bed." And then his gaze found the letter still open in Aldrich's hand, and something in his face went very still and very careful, the stillness of a man doing sums of his own at speed. He did not lunge for it. He was too practised a man to make so cheap a mistake in front of witnesses, and Maren understood in that moment, watching him, that this was exactly the quality that had let him do what he had done for 9 quiet years without ever once being caught at it. That he was patient in the particular way that made patient men dangerous, long after impatient ones would have been stopped. That is an old and unhappy business, your Grace, best left where the years have put it, and I would ask, as a man who has served your house faithfully since before you could walk it unaided, that you weigh 9 years of my service against 1 letter, whose hand no living witness will swear is mine. It is your seal, Aldrich said. Seals are borrowed and pressed by clerks 12 times a day, said Halden, without heat, that proves a careless steward, your Grace, not a murderous one, and I would remind you gently that the woman standing at your shoulder has every reason in the world to want this letter to say what she needs it to say, whatever its ink actually does or does not prove. It was, Maren thought, even through the cold fury the words put in her, not a stupid argument, and that was the worst of it, that he was not a fool grasping at straws, but a clever man making the best case a clever man could make from a bad position. And some part of her hated him more for how nearly reasonable he sounded than she would have hated him for shouting. Aldrich did not shout either. He said, very evenly, that the matter would be heard properly, before witnesses at the hall, and not settled in an old man's doorway by anyone's private assurance, and Halden bowed to that with perfect grace, and said he welcomed nothing more than a full and fair hearing, and rode away with his men at an unhurried pace that told Maren he was already, somewhere behind that calm face, building the next version of events he would need. That night, back at the hall for the first time since the ambush, Aldrich came to find Maren in the small chamber given her near the kitchens, and the thing he said was not the thing she had braced herself to hear. He said she should go home to Aldemira before the hearing, quietly, with an escort, and stay there until it was over, because Halden was a man who struck at whatever stood nearest him when cornered, and Aldrich could not protect her inside these walls the way he could protect her at a distance from them. He meant it, she understood later, entirely as a kindness. In the moment she heard only that he was sending her away the very night the truth had finally surfaced, after 9 years of silence, as though her part in uncovering it ended the instant it became dangerous to hold, and something old and well-worn in her, some long habit of expecting exactly this, closed over the hurt of it before she had even properly felt it arrive. She said, very quietly, that he need not trouble an escort, that she had walked home from worse than this alone, and she left before dawn, on her own feet, with the robin in her pocket, and did not look back at the hall once, and it was 3 days before Sailor, arriving at the cottage with her mouth already set for an argument, told her flatly that the Duke had asked after her twice a day since, and had been told each time, by his own steward's arrangement, that she had refused to be found. The hearing was set for the great hall at Marchful on the 9th day after Holt's letter came to light, and Sailor, who had not set foot inside that hall in 30 years, and said so twice on the walk there, as though daring anyone to remark on it, walked in at Maren's side anyway, uninvited and entirely undeterred. The hall filled slowly, and then all at once, the way crowds do. Villagers from Aldermere pressed in among the household staff and the minor lords of the march who had ridden in on 3 days' notice, Justice Holt seated near the dais with the court roll, and Haldon's letter both laid before him on the table, in plain sight of everyone. Lady Cerridwen standing near the Duke's chair, rather than seated beside it, which Marin noticed, and did not yet understand. Aldric rose when the hall had quieted, and did not waste words on ceremony. He said that a wrong done 9 years past had come newly to light, and that he meant it read aloud in full in this hall, before every person it concerned, so that no two of them could afterward claim to have heard different things said on the same day, and Holt himself read the court roll first. In his old, dry, precise voice, the record of Isolde's trial in all its indecent haste, and then Aldric read the letter. Slowly, the promise of silver, the seal, and the hall that had been merely murmuring, went entirely silent, in the particular way a room goes silent when it understands, altogether, in the same instant, what it is actually looking at. Haldon stood through all of it with his hands folded and his face composed, and when it was done he spoke for himself with real skill, saying again that a seal proved carelessness and not murder, that he had served the march faithfully for 2 decades and built its granaries and kept its roads and paid its garrison through 2 hard winters, and asking whether all of that weighed nothing at all against one letter and the word of a herb wife's daughter with an old grievance. It might have worked, on a hall less prepared, on a duke less patient. But Aldric had one more thing laid on the table. A second ledger Assayan's own quiet inquiries had turned up buried beneath a loose flag in the tally house floor. In Haldon's own hand this time, and no others, recording in his own careful figures 9 years of grain sold quietly out from under the crown's tithe, and the silver from it never once reaching the granary or the hall, and it was the sight of that second book, brought out and laid beside the first, that finally broke something in Haldon's careful composure. Because he crossed the space between himself and the table in 3 quick steps, and reached for it before he had decided to, before anyone in the room had time to stop him, and Ossian's hand closed over his wrist a full second before it reached the page. It was such a small thing, that one grasping movement, and it undid 20 years of a smile more thoroughly than any speech could have, because a room full of people who had half believed his gentle protestations a moment before now watched him lunge for evidence like a man with everything to hide, and the murmur that went through the hall then was not outrage so much as a kind of collective, quiet recognition, the sound of many people seeing the same true thing at the same moment. Haldon straightened slowly, and for one unguarded instant, before the composure came back over his face like a shutter drawn closed, Marin saw something genuinely afraid looking out of his eyes, not at the Duke, not at the ledger, but at Justice Holt, at an old man he had once used and never expected to answer to. "I did not mean for it to go so far," he said, quietly, to no one in particular, and it was the only entirely honest sentence Marin ever heard him say. Aldric did not have him dragged out in chains before the assembled hall. He said only that Holden Vance was stripped of his stewardship and his lands in the march from that hour, and would be escorted to the border by nightfall to answer for the rest before the Crown's own justices, and Holden, given that much grace, bowed to him with something that might almost have been genuine gratitude, and walked out of the hall on his own feet with his head level, and Marin, watching him go, felt the strange small mercy of not hating him quite as much in that last moment as she had a quarter-hour before. Lady Cerridwen was the one who moved first once the hall had begun to breathe again, crossing the space to stand before Maren rather than before Aldrich, which surprised the room more than anything Helden had done. "I told you I was not your enemy in this," she said, "and I meant it more than I think you believed at the time." And then, turning so that both Aldrich and the hall could hear her plainly, she said she had known for some months that the match between herself and Aldrich had been a treaty dressed as an affection, useful to both their houses and warm enough between them as old friends, but never once the thing either of them had watched grow, unbidden, in a cottage at the edge of Thornwood, in the space of 9 cold days, and she released him from the betrothal there in the hall, with a small dry smile, and the observation that she had always preferred an honest peace to a comfortable lie, and that she expected, at the very least, to be invited to the wedding, and seated somewhere, with a decent view of the room. It was the single most generous thing Maren had ever watched one person do for another in public, and she understood, watching Ceridwen walk out of the hall with her head as level as Holden's had been for entirely different reasons, that this was a woman who had just given away a great deal, more than a betrothal, and made it look, for the sake of everyone watching, almost effortless. Aldrich came to Maren then, in front of the whole slow emptying hall, and did not make a speech of it, because he had never been a man who needed an audience to say a true thing. He said only that he had been wrong to send her away the night the truth first surfaced, that he had told himself it was for her safety, and had not looked closely enough at whether it was also, a little, for his own comfort, to have the danger of loving her at some manageable distance rather than close enough to touch, and that he would not make that mistake again if she would give him the chance not to. Maren did not answer him softly. She said, quite plainly, in front of Holt and Sailor, and every villager still lingering by the door, that she would come back to him on her own terms and none other, that she would not be a duchess who forgot how to set a bone or draw a poultice, that the common land the Tally House had quietly shaved from Aldermere's boundary these 9 years past, under Halden's careful figures, would be restored to the village by name and by deed before any wedding took place, and that her mother's name would be entered into the court roll beside the truth of what had been done to her, in ink, where anyone might read it for 100 years after all of them were gone. Aldrich said yes to every term before she had finished naming the last of them, and Holt, listening, said that he would enter it himself, gladly, as the one true correction his own long career most badly needed, and Sella, from somewhere near the door, said only that it was about time somebody in that family learned to negotiate properly, which was as near to a blessing as Sella ever gave anyone. They were married the following spring, once the ford ran clear again, and the roads dried, in a ceremony Maren kept smaller and plainer than the hall's stewards thought entirely proper, though Ceridwen came as promised, and sat, as promised, somewhere with an excellent view of the room. A year on from the night she had found him in the snow, Maren stood again in her old cottage doorway at the edge of Thornwood, kept now, not as her only home, but as the place she still went whenever the hall grew too loud in her ears, and the day was mild and the fields beyond it green instead of white, and a real robin, not the carved one, sat for a moment on the sill before startling off into the new leaves. The carved one sat where it always had, except that its broken wing was gone now, replaced with a second small wing carved so carefully to match the first that only Maren, running her thumb over the seam the way she always had, could feel where the old break had been at all, mended by Aldrich himself over a long, slow winter of evenings by that same hearth, taught the patience of it, he said, entirely by watching her hands work all those months before. He came up the path on foot rather than on horseback, without an escort, the way he had learned to prefer coming to this particular door, and stopped where Captain Ossian's men had once stood ringed around the cottage in the cold, and said the same question he had asked her that very first ordinary morning after, half in earnest and half not, whether the herb wife of Aldemir had anything in the house for a man who had been out riding too long, and was fairly certain he had caught a chill. And Marin, robin in hand, told him to come in and sit by the fire, and be still, and be quiet, in that order, and shut the door behind them both against the mild spring evening, and that is where we will leave them. If this quiet one kept you company tonight, stay by the fire a little longer before you go. I keep thinking about that mended wing, carved so carefully you'd only ever feel the seam if you already knew where to look. And if there's a broken thing in your own story you've been quietly working to mend, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if you'd like another evening like this one, settle in and subscribe to Jess Circa H channel _name Megai. Because the kettle's already on, and there's another tale waiting to be lit against the dark. Until then, sleep gently, and be kind to whatever in you is still healing.